Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening whenever you're watching this. Surprise, surprise, I'm here in all of my good old-fashioned. A lot of students recently have stated that my lessons have been boring and not entertaining, so hopefully this will keep you engaged and excited about what we're talking about and what we're learning. I'm actually in the confines of my office at my house. You guys, I talk all the time about basketball. If you look on the right back there, that poster, you guys know I grew up in Indiana, so Hoosiers, the movie Hoosiers, is a big part of my life, and I've been recording different stuff for the past couple years, and my wife has decided to put my treadmill in here. I guess kind of a motivation to try to keep me getting into shape and stuff. So this is my office where I do a lot of my work. I do a lot of my thinking. So welcome. So today's lesson, we're going to be talking about Africa culture. Today's objective is at the end of this lesson, you're going to be able to understand cultural diffusion, cultural diversity, and urbanization. So let's start it off with cultural diversity. Cultural diversity is a wide variety of cultures in a particular region, areas of living throughout the world. Some examples that have been given are West Africa, New York, Paris, Washington, D.C. So I want you to just imagine, typically in small towns there isn't a lot of cultural diversity because typically everybody is very similar. But if you go, whenever you guys get the opportunity someday, whenever you guys become successful and you venture out in the world, if you visited New York City, or I'll even give you an example of Washington, D.C. I remember whenever I was a senior in high school, our senior trip, we went to Washington, D.C., and we saw a wide variety of people from the Middle East. We saw people from Asia. We saw people, people who look like they're from the United States. So we had some people who are from Africa as well. That whenever we saw this stuff, whenever we went to Washington D.C., and so there was a lot of diversity there, and typically whenever there is diversity, there is potential and grounds for conflict because people don't understand and people don't want to know how and the way people think and the way they do things. People just kind of see them as different. But an example I gave you guys, and even still here in Horse Cave, when two people are in a room, we have diversity because we both weren't brought up the same way. If I was in a classroom with my friend from high school named Steve Kearney, he grew up totally different than I did, and I grew up totally different than he did. He had some parents. He lost his parents at a young age. I still had my parents, so there's some diversity there. Another thing of diversity. He was one of only 2 kids. I was one of 4. So there was some diversity there in the way things were going, and maybe you guys can understand, or maybe you can't understand the grasp of things, but how it relates to you in Horse Cave. But something I would say is, how many of you guys are an only child? Okay, then how many of you guys have multiple siblings? That's diversity. Or what happens if you've had divorce in your family and your parents remarried, so you have a stepbrother or stepsister? And then how many people have not had a divorce or a remarriage and you're still with your parents? So we have different things, and obviously money as well. Some people are rich, some people are poor. That's diversity, and how they interact, and their interactions dictate how they're going to do things. But I actually got this from the University of Oregon. I tried to give you guys a good example of what diversity is, and what diversity says is it means understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. These can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities. I don't know if you guys can see this, but it says religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. It is the exploration of these differences in a safe, positive, and nurturing environment. It is also understanding each other and moving beyond simple tolerance to embrace and celebrating the rich dimensions of diversity contained with each individual. So, whenever we have diversity, and again, two people are in a room, excuse me, we have diversity. Just be receptive and acceptive of ways that people have discussed and the ways they grew up. It might be a little bit different. Now, just because someone has a different opinion doesn't mean you have to agree with it. What it means is you have to respect how they came about, and that's cultural diversity. And how this relates to West Africa, from what we've been discussing, there are hundreds of different groups in Africa that have different cultural diversity. I've read somewhere over 150 languages. So, how are people going to interact with that? How are you going to understand? Religiously, how are people going to interact if someone's believes in Islam and then maybe someone who's a Christian? How are they going to interact? You might not have to agree with their religious beliefs or the way they speak or the way they look, but you have to respect their opinions on the situation. So that's cultural diversity, okay, and we have it every day. Cultural diffusion is a shortened summary, spreading out of different cultures through an area. And again, I gave you the examples of, excuse me, of New York City, Washington, D.C. So just imagine that you are in New York or Washington, D.C., or let's do a more concentrated area. Let's go into Africa. And let's specifically look at Egypt. So the Egyptians have a specific type of belief traditions that they have. They spread out throughout the world, throughout Europe, throughout Asia. They're now incorporating their culture throughout Europe, throughout Asia, and people are going to start to believe in their customs and traditions with it. And the best example I could give you guys is that of a tomato splattering. Whenever you throw tomato on the ground, it splatters everywhere, and it can reach, north, south, east, west, southwest, etc., etc. So that's cultural diffusion. Again, it's the spreading out of your culture throughout a specific area. Whenever, again, I'm from Indiana, so I've moved down to Horse Cave. I live in central Kentucky. I'm starting to spread my culture, part of my culture, down into this area. Whenever you guys go to college and you become successful, if you move away from Horse Cave, Cave City area, you're going to be spreading out your culture. And it could be different or it could be similar to where you might be relocating. So that's cultural diffusion. So we talked about cultural diversity. It's a combination of people living in a small area, and they're being respectful with each other's opinions. Cultural diffusion, you spread out your cultural beliefs and throughout the rest of the world, and you're part of the area. So those are the two things. Urbanization. It's more families are moving from rural areas to more urban areas of life. This is not only happening in West Africa, but throughout the world. So something I want you guys to think about. Why is that happening? Okay, and if you don't know what a rural area is, it's like a farming area, and an urban area is that of a major city. I gave you some examples in there. Why are people moving from a farming area to a city? From an economic standpoint, I think it should be fairly simple. There's more job opportunities typically in an urban area where a family will be able to maybe provide for their needs and of their family, maybe financially a little bit better. Now with moving from a rural to an urban area, the cost of living is going to be something that's going to be totally different as well. And things might be more expensive. It might be difficult for people to be able to make that price. Living in, I have family who lives in New York City. They make what we would consider incredibly good money, but that money is the equivalent of someone who maybe, making my salary in Kentucky, she makes well over $150,000 a year for what she does, but she really doesn't have that much money in the grand scheme of things whenever you talk about the cost of living, renting the house, or buying the house where she is, having insurance on that, driving. If she has a car, she has to pay and she does have a car, she has to pay for renting a parking space every month, and it's not $25, it's not $50. It's usually anywhere between $150 to $500, and that's just for a nice mid-level place. It can be more expensive. Living in New York City as well, sometimes you have to pay taxi and taxi fees to go from one spot to the next. So that's some things that you guys need to think about, and why people move from a rural to an urban area. Also, we've talked about the Sahara Desert and desertification. So a lot of the farming area has been slowly disappearing. They can't grow there; it's uninhabitable anymore. So people need to try to find jobs and opportunities to help provide for their family. That is today's lesson. I hope you guys learned something from the lesson today. Again, we talked about cultural diffusion, cultural diversity, and we talked about urbanization. And those are all three different things that are on your study guide, and hopefully you get a better understanding of them.